the motivation that was catalyzing my action was built in fear, right? The former was built in opportunity. The latter was built in fear. And so my desire to speak in the latter came from a place that wasn't great.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey friends, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me this week for episode 265, where today we're talking about the exhaustion of explaining yourself and how to risk with courage, among other things. But today, Dave Hollis will unpack why when we're feeling frustrated and unfulfilled, the source of our discontent can often be traced back to the gap that exists between who we are at our core and how we feel like we have to show up to get affirmation from outside sources. We're also going to go after what it's like to date after divorce and how to dump falsehood. Also today, Dave will teach us how to handle criticism without going into self-protection or self-promotion mode, and that's all shame. But quickly, before we head into the conversation with Dave, if you're enjoying Win Today, share it. Send a text to a friend, to a family member, and invite them to listen as well. And then rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, especially Apple Podcast. Here's why. When you rate, review, and share Win Today, the listenership here grows. Simple as that. So thank you for listening and for doing just that. Right now, my conversation with Dave Hollis. You're listening to Win Today. Dave, welcome to Win Today. I'm so glad you're here.
Christopher, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited for today's conversation, Dave, but I want to start in a little obscure place. You landed on the phone with Steven freaking Spielberg. How did that happen? I read that in the book and I'm like, I got to hear about this.
Well, it's such a weird thing because I had this job that among the requirements was managing the relationships that we as the Walt Disney Company had with the filmmakers who were making movies for the individual brands. And I happened to have stumbled into this work amidst the greatest collection of intellectual property in the history of the movie business, in that Disney had acquired Pixar, Marvel, and Lucas, and had a distribution deal with DreamWorks Studios, which Steven is the chairman of. And so my job was, among other things, to foster a relationship with the filmmakers and heads of each of these individual brands, iconic brands, in a way that would have me helping them understand the logic behind where we were planning to put the movies that they were creating on the calendar, and explain a little of how we were managing the relationship with movie theaters so that their work could show up best in front of a consumer's eyes. And one of the weird things that I had as a part of my responsibility was early on getting a glimpse at movies that were not themselves yet finished so that I might be able to provide some insight or feedback, which is like even silly in real time for me to suggest out loud. Though I think myself to be a creative person, I'm wildly more comfortable with analytics and data than I am with instinct when it comes to creative. But one of the things I had to do, I watched a movie of his in the midst of this run that we had called Warhorse. My boss reminded me that I needed to jump into a quick conversation with him to let him know what I thought of this early screening of his film. I offered naively, it was the first of my 7 years running the sales organization at the Walt Disney Company, some unsolicited feedback on an observation I had in his filmmaking, though he was and is the most commercially and critically acclaimed filmmaker of all time. Here, Dave Hollis, human who's made 0 movies. Let me give you a little bit of insight into how I might change something in your movie, sir. And he schooled me, and it was perfect. And I lived for a length of time under my desk where mail was now sent to me after having received his insight and wisdom.
Well, it's so cool because what I want to ask out of that story, Dave, is about perspective and really how perspective changes the way we make decisions in life. I'd love to know, what did you learn out of that?
Well, more than anything, it was humbling because there was a part of me that thought that I was meant to prove my worthiness of the role that I had been entrusted in by affording him an insight that I, in my hubris, didn't appreciate that, of course, he'd already considered. And so what I took away from it was, of course, this person who started making movies when I was born had the experience and the insight and the wisdom to have considered the reason why he created the sequence that I brought into question, and that I was probably better served listening and observing the instincts of people who'd been in the arena far longer than I had been, rather than trying to insert myself in a way that would attempt to show my credibility, even though I was actually compromising my credibility for having tried to make the suggestion in the first place.
That's interesting. So I guess the question I want to ask is, in those early days, and this is really going to take us into the meat of the conversation today, how much did fear and insecurity inform the posture of that conversation with Stephen, and even what you gleaned coming out of it?
Well, I think any of us, when we find ourselves inside of a circumstance that maybe goes just beyond what we believe ourselves to be totally credible for or capable of, want so badly to convince the people that we think are judging whether or not we are actually deserving of the seat that we have at the table that we are in fact deserving, when so often no one is asking those questions. It's our own insecurities, it's our own self-doubt that is chirping in our heads. And I mean, the masterclass that I got just before I was put into this role, I had a boss who I'd been promoted a few times faster than most, and I found myself in a room, and every time there was a silence in that room, I was trying to inject something smart, because in my mind, I was worried that other people had contrived some worry or thought of me not being the person who deserved to be promoted faster than them. And he asked me to walk down to his office. And as I was heading down the hall, I thought maybe I was going to be recognized for insights above and beyond the call of duty, that I was going to be given a statue of some kind. And as the door shut, he was like, "Hey, shut up." I mean, he actually used an expletive in helping pierce a little tiny part of my soul. But he, in saying, "shut up," was offering me the best piece of advice that I probably could have received, which was, you believe yourself to be helping your credibility by trying to be smart every time there's a silence in that room, even if it doesn't connect necessarily to the agenda of the day or the thing that we were talking about, when actually you are inviting people to question if you deserve to be in the seat, because what feels very transparently to every other person in the room like an overreach in your insecurity manifesting itself now in needing to speak in situations where your voice is not necessary. And so it was this beautiful reminder that, I mean, he also said, and I think this is important, I wouldn't have put you in the job if I didn't think you to be the person that could handle the responsibility of this role. Trust that I have an insight for your skills being applicable in this space, and push back against that insecurity or imposter syndrome that would have you getting in your own way. And so in that situation, man, there was a learning: bite your tongue, sit back, listen, and only interject when you can value add to something that will actually drive the conversation forward. And in the situation with Stephen or any other filmmaker, it became this appreciation for know your role, add value when it is something that can be additive, and otherwise, shut up.
What's interesting, though, is on the other side of this, Dave, you had a similar situation with a totally different outcome when you wanted to work at the Super Bowl. Take us back to that. What happened?
Yeah. I mean, very, very early on in my career, I was someone who was interested in manufacturing opportunity for myself, and wasn't yet in a place where I'd been taught to take no for an answer. And I think something that ends up happening, unfortunately, to many of us as years go by, is that we end up believing voices of authority who have created limits or ceilings on what is possible for us, or when they say no, we just accept it as the final answer instead of looking at alternatives. I was 23 years old. I was working at Fox. They were broadcasting the Super Bowl that year, and I wanted more than anything to work that Super Bowl. And so I made a bold move and went to my boss's boss, asked if I might be of service, and got a no. Nope, we don't have it in the budget. You don't have the set of skills. It's really just a budget thing, though. So thank you for asking, but the answer is no. And I took the answer that was given, it's a constraint in budget, and said, you know what? I'm only making $22,000 a year. I'm eating ramen 4 nights a week, but I will commit to eating ramen a couple more nights a week by buying myself a ticket to Miami, because I want to show how badly I want to be of service and how much I believe that I can be a solution provider in a world where they need solutions. And I went back to that boss's boss with the receipt of this ticket that I'd purchased. And I said, hey, I've heard your reason why I can't go. I've eliminated that as a reason. I bought my own ticket. Where would you like me to work? I've found a place to stay. I've got a ticket. There's no cost to you as a company. And he incredulously shook his head, appreciative of the initiative, and put me on the desk of a producer of the pregame show. And I got to fulfill a thing that was a dream of mine at the time, to stand on the field of the Super Bowl and to support the initiative of the company. But truly, I was interested in watching the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons play a game on the pitch.
Okay, what I want to do, Dave, is ask you to drill down on a teaching point for us, which is this. How do we know? How do we discern when to speak up versus, as you said, when to stay quiet and shut up? With Spielberg, you found yourself crawling underneath the desk, so to speak. But when it came to the Super Bowl, you found yourself in a job. How do we discern the difference between the situations? When to leverage the strength of I'm speaking up for myself versus it's wisdom to stay quiet and learn? Teach us.
Well, I think the former, the decision to try and manufacture a yes out of a no, came out of an appreciation for what I believe to be an undervaluing of me as a contributor in an environment that I thought I could be of service in. And as I describe in the book, the hubris that exists in a positive way in believing in yourself before other people convince you to stop believing. And so I do believe that there is something in connecting to that person you used to be before society, before the company, before your partner, before life tried to convince you to play it smaller or just, be okay with being okay. The other end of that spectrum, though, for me was as opportunity was presenting itself, and I found myself on bigger stages or in bigger rooms with bigger names, the motivation that was catalyzing my action was built in fear, right? The former was built in opportunity. The latter was built in fear. And so my desire to speak in the latter came from a place that wasn't great. And I couldn't see it. By the way, I couldn't actually even maybe differentiate from it in real time, but I can in retrospect. And in having had that experience and now seeing the difference, I know, tap into those impulses that are built in opportunity and save yourself from getting in your own way when fear is the catalyst in trying to step in when you'd be better off in standing back.
Okay, let's stay on fear, because very first line of your book, fear has been the strongest and most consistent emotion of your entire life. So if fear is the emotion, Dave, how did that emotion then establish your beliefs, thoughts, and actions?
Well, I wish this wasn't the case, though I guess I can't say that because I love who I am now and I am who I am because of all of the experiences of my life. But at the very, very earliest stages of my life, I had achievement as a thing that I was programmed for in a both healthy and unhealthy way, in that my want for achievement was connected to being lovable enough and worthy when I could check a certain box, if I could get a certain grade, after I memorized a certain Bible verse, whatever it was. And so my having become valedictorian of my high school, or getting perfect attendance in this class, or having a trophy from this sport, or whatever it ended up being, was driven primarily out of programming that it was a lie. I can see it now, that there was conditionality into my lovability because of my achievement. And in some respects, I have gratitude for it because, man, I worked really, really hard for 20 plus years inside of an entertainment companies that allowed me to go from assistant to president. I had something that made me run faster and push harder. But I also, in pushing to a peak that had me as president of distribution at the Walt Disney Company, realized that, none of these titles, not this salary, the access or these relationships with great filmmakers, none of them have made me more lovable than I was when I first started. None of them have made me love myself, frankly, more than when I first started. There must be something different in this. And deconstructing that relationship that I have between achievement and my lovability or my enoughness or my worthiness is something that has really been the work of the last 5 years, where I now can appreciate, irrespective of what I accomplish, irrespective of my status or my salary or my connections or any of it, I am already and before worthy and enough and lovable. And if I were to achieve, the only thing that might affect the way that I feel about myself when I'm by myself is if that action, if that achievement in any ways honors the intention of a creator who put me here for very, very specific reason.
I want to unpack your deconstruction process, as you just mentioned a little bit. So for me, fear motivates me to just second guess myself and then feel like I owe everyone an explanation. And when I read that section of your book, I went, oh, I'm not the only one. So you wrote about the importance, and I think this plays into your deconstruction process, but correct me if I'm wrong. You said letting go of the need for a tidy explanation for everything that happens to you and around you is so important. So to double click on this, I think is important because I see a couple things happening, Dave. The first is we've got to learn how to let go of approval addiction. And the second is honestly just faith and trust. And as you said, there's a creator who put you here on purpose. Take us inside your deconstruction process.
Yeah, I mean, I've really, like the through line almost of the book and the way that I've tried to approach the last handful of years of my life, where I am disconnected from so many of the things that I thought I needed to have to be full or happy or enough or respected, has come back to this single belief that each of us, you, every listener, and myself, we were each created with very intentional, impeccable design, and that the work we have on this planet is to honor the intention of a creator who knew with just 100% certainty what he was doing as we were created and put on this planet. That my experiences, my wiring, the way that I think, feel, love, all of it makes me this unique, limited edition, one of one. And in that, I now get to be free from comparing myself to anyone else or any other standard, because I am unlike anyone who's ever been or ever will be. And so the only thing that I have to stay connected to is how I create integrity between the expectations of what I have been afforded in gifts, what I have been afforded in opportunity, what I have been placed here on this planet for, and the way I show up every day to actualize that. And truly, like at the end of the day, the only time when I end up feeling not as good about myself when I'm by myself is when there's dissonance between me having shown up well for that purpose that I'm on this planet for, and the thing I could have otherwise done to fully actualize it. Like that space that might exist, that dissonance between who I could have been and who I showed up as, that's where shame, that's where self-confidence compromise, that's where my self-loathing or critic live. And I am every single day trying to do the work to try and close the gap between who I know I'm here to be and how I'd have to show up to actually make that person actually be here. And so the deconstruction, long way of answering the question, has really come down to this question of who then would I have to be to create that integrity, right? I call it a what if, an if then kind of statement, right? If I want to be this kind of dad or this kind of partner or this kind of leader or this kind of influence in the world, then I'd have to do what things on a regular basis to create that kind of integrity that at the end of the day, as my head hits the pillow, makes me feel a sense of having lived into and honor the intention of a creator who created in me this reason for being.
I'm super fascinated, Dave. You've used the word integrity 3 times now. And the word integrity has within it a root, which is integer. Integer is whole. It's where we speak of whole numbers, of course. I'd love to know your journey, and rather, was it a journey of wholeness from the inside out where you had to deal with the incongruence of expectation and reality and living in authenticity and truth?
Absolutely. I mean, what's crazy is I started 2020, end of 2019, I make this proclamation. This is going to be my best year ever. I've saved it for my 45th year on the planet. And in an attempt to manufacture, to engineer this best year ever had, I actually took 3 days out in the middle of nowhere, Tucson desert, to cast a vision for what it would take to engineer that best year ever showing up. In order to do that, I actually did a looking backward exercise to identify every time I had been stuck in the previous 5 years. Like, where did I get in my own way? Where were the times when I didn't feel great about myself when I was by myself? So that if there was a single variable or a couple of variables that were present in each of those instances, I might identify them to preempt them in this attempt to engineer this best year ever. And of course, as it turns out, the thing that was present in each of those times was that dissonance that I speak of, where I knew that I'd either made promises to myself that I didn't keep, or that I had a certain amount of potential that I wasn't actualizing, or that I'd made commitments to my family that I wasn't honoring, but there was something that just wasn't aligned. And that idea that there wasn't congruence in who I knew I ought to be, or who I could be, or who I was telling people I wanted to be, and how I was showing up, that was where I was stuck. And so for me, the integrity work really just ended up coming back to, okay, you know when you don't feel like you have integrity, how can you manufacture? How can you engineer it? And so the work of the last 18 months of my life and for the rest of my life is I want to try and close the gap every single day between the things that I do in negative coping mechanisms or bad habits, the things that I do in living into fear rather than standing in truth, that would keep me from creating integrity between who I know I want to be or have to be to feel the way I want to feel at the end of the day and the way that I'm actually showing up. And that single thing, that single act of integrity has been the most consistent through line in feeling the way I'd hope to feel when I'm by myself that any of us have an opportunity for. Is it easy? Absolutely not easy. But it is an answer key in the back of the book that if you want to get straight A grades, this is all you got to do.
Hey friends, we're taking a quick break to tell you about one of our awesome partners, and that's my friends over at Nutrafol. 80 million men and women in the US experience thinning hair, yet it's still not openly talked about, which can make going through it feel scary and stressful, and that just adds to the problem. Listen, I'm in my late 30s and flat out, I want to keep my hair healthy and thick as I age, and that's why I started using Nutrafol. Nutrafol is formulated with potent botanicals to help you grow hair as strong as you are, and it's physician formulated to be 100% drug-free. They use natural, clinically effective botanicals for better hair growth through whole body health. Does it work? Yes. In clinical studies, Nutrafol users saw thicker, stronger hair growth with less shedding in 3 to 6 months. You can grow thicker, healthier hair and support our show by going to Nutrafol.com and using promo code WIN today to save $15 off your first month subscription. This is their best offer available anywhere, and it's only available to U.S. customers for a limited time. Plus, free shipping on every order. Get $15 off at Nutrafol.com, spelled Nutrafol.com, promo code WIN today for hair as strong as you are. Don't wait to start addressing early stages of thinning hair. Join me today, Nutrafol.com, promo code WIN today. All one word, WIN today. Let's get back to the conversation. I know a lot of listeners right now are going, oh my gosh, my heart's beating a little fast, because you are speaking straight to all of us. And I wrote a couple things down, Dave, and I just want to ask you maybe to distill this for all of us as the teaching point. But what I heard you say is the thread through that is that we need to learn how to close the gap between a couple things. Number one, what I heard you say is between falsehood and truth. So maybe a lot of us today are listening and we're living in these false identities built through fear, guilt, shame, instead of stepping to our true identity. The second thing, Dave, I heard you say is that we need to close the gap between perhaps what I'd call hiddenness and then just showing up in life saying, this is who I am. Number one, did I distill that properly? And number two, if there's anything else you could add, I just want to create a sticking point for listeners before we move on.
Yeah, I actually think the latter is even more important than the former, in that if there's a thing, at least in my life, that has perpetually created pain, it is the representation of one thing and the actualization of another, right? You're suggesting that everything's great on social. You are living inside of suffering that you are familiar with in private. And the dissonance between the optics of what is on the outside and the practical of what is actually happening creates pain, suffering. It's shame. It's all of those things. And so for me, I mean, my last book was this attempt to suggest the 20 ways that I got in my way through my life. And it was a hard book to write because it required a lot of vulnerability around stuff that I wasn't necessarily proud of. But what was crazy is that in the vulnerability of owning and creating integrity between my truth, even the stuff I wasn't proud of, it turned the things I had shame for into power. Hey, I'm not proud of this, but I'm working on it. And at least in me acknowledging it honestly, you get to see me. You actually get to see all of me. And in the truth of me representing who I am, I give myself now the opportunity to become who I'm meant to be. And it doesn't now have the encumbrance of who you're representing yourself to be, the shame of not yet being in that place. There's power in just acknowledging I am here, imperfect and full of struggle like every other person on this planet, and I'm doing the work to try and get better.
You know, Dave, it's interesting because there's a level of authenticity, and obviously this is the first time we've met, but I've been following your story for the last couple of years. And, you know, I think one of the things that you demonstrated, because you have a large public following, and truth be told, I think your divorce was public in many ways.
Yeah.
I think you demonstrated what you just shared about the optics, the representation of one thing versus the actual and the real and the vulnerability. Like, walk us through, how did you decide, what informed the decisions you made regarding the fact that you were walking through something really tumultuous, really grievous in a public light? Walk us through that.
Yeah. I mean, the headline, unfortunately, because I have a lot of empathy for anyone who I was in community with prior to the divorce, in their having not seen what ended up happening coming. I didn't also see it coming. And I think there was, in that rug pull, something that felt deservedly hard. And so there, in that, was a decision that I had to make, like, hey, was there any part of how I, in not having seen everything, was I complicit in any way of like maybe not owning fully all the struggle that might have existed behind the scenes or the challenges of working together? As much as I never thought we'd get divorced, certainly it felt like we were sharing some of what was happening that might be leading to some of the issues we had. But I didn't think we were going to get divorced. And then when we did, I had to make a choice to either bury my head in the sand or keep living. And I also, because of the way this community has been such an awesome and unbelievable part of my life for the last handful of years, couldn't imagine doing life or going through it without also including them in some of it in a way that felt like, it felt cathartic in a certain way, which maybe doesn't even make sense to anyone who doesn't have the bizarre life that I end up having in somewhat of a public eye. But to be able to share a little bit of what I was experiencing, in some ways I was hoping might give permission for someone else who was going through a hard time to be okay with it being hard. And in sharing some tears or sharing some triumph or sharing whatever it ended up being, I was emboldened and empowered by the reflection from others of their having seen some of themselves in my story, but also felt more normal myself in the most abnormal time of my life, because in being able to really showcase the truth of what I was going through, it allowed other people to say, hey, you're human. It's normal. It's okay. And I mean, like, I had the benefit too. I met someone in this person, Heidi, that I'm dating in real time, who was about a year ahead of me in her own divorce journey. And as much as we met to record a podcast that never actually ended up getting recorded because of my inability to speak words without crying, her empathy for being a little further in this journey and normalize the feelings that I was having is part of why we find ourselves where we do in a relationship today. And I think that's that idea that, like, sharing your truth and having yourself be seen as, you know, completely who you are and what you are, and affirmed for being normal or okay, or a part of what a grief journey ends up looking like, is the thing that any of us who have to experience hard things ultimately want, to be ourselves and to be made to feel normal. And so going through it publicly wasn't easy, but I have a massive amount of gratitude for the way that I was able to, in community, share pretty honestly what I was experiencing and have other people say, you're normal, brother. Like, this sucks and it's going to be hard until it's not, but it also is probably meant to be. And maybe there's some good that'll come from it.
As you were sharing there a moment ago, Dave, I had this phrase pop in my head: courage requires community. Number one, what do you think about that? Number two, did it for you? Sounds like it did.
Oh, 100%. I mean, so what's interesting is, any of the times that I was living in that space of dissonance, like outside of integrity, the instinct I think we each have as humans is to do it alone. Like, there's shame. We don't want to have to confess that we're not living as our best selves. And the thing that I have found is, every time, anytime I'm living in a place that is in dissonance, honestly representing the struggle has connected me to other people who also are themselves wrestling in that same season, in a way that normalizes the work to get into integrity, but that also invites the possibility of a resource or help from someone who also has found themselves in that same state of struggle, to say, oh, you know, when I was there, I actually read this book, or I did this kind of therapy, or I was at this church, or I had this conversation with this friend, and immediately it's a time machine. It just like jumps you forward in your processing journey because of your willingness to bring the thing that you are uncomfortable with or have shame for into the light. And so it does. Is it easy? No, of course it's not easy. But like any of the things that I've ever processed that I've had shame around, where I've been comfortable enough to confess, hey, I'm still working through this thing, it has immediately normalized me as not being the only person working through it, and has also invited me into community with people who had solution or a connection that could expedite my getting the kind of resources that I need to get closer to whole. And I want to encourage anyone. Shame festers in the dark. It lives and thrives there. And the only answer that I have ever seen that helps me get closer to wholeness has been honesty and vulnerability, even when it was hard, in community with other people, and a lot of people, frankly, so that I could feel less alone in my struggle.
Shame festers in the dark. And I've heard versions of that before, but that just hit me in a really visceral way, Dave, because, and the vast majority of people that are joined in this conversation with us right now follow Jesus. And so I can just go here. I find it interesting how primitive shame is in our anthropology, and how the fingerprints of the enemy are not verbose and gregarious, but instead they're subtle. And the fingerprints of the enemy live in secrecy and in shame, where we isolate then and start to believe lies. And then when we believe the lies, we fortify strongholds inside our minds. So I'm really fascinated by that.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and it is exactly as you say. It's spiritual warfare on a certain level.
Sure.
It is something meant to play at your deepest insecurities, and it is not for the faint of heart. I mean, I do believe with certainty that it requires just a massive amount of courage to confront the things that you are having to confront. When I talk about building a plan in the book, the first thing I say is that you have to have a hyper sense of self-awareness in where you're starting from, or you cannot draw a map from where you are to where you're going.
Yeah.
And that willingness to get radically candid with what it is that you're working through, the coping mechanisms that are going to get in your way. I mentioned in the book the idea of the secondary storm. There was I was on a run. I'm having yet again, I ran like 2,000 miles in the midst of this last year. It was my coping mechanism to get through the hardest year of my life. But on many of the runs, I'm listening to a sermon as I'm running. And there was a sermon from Stephen Furtick that I was listening to one day that was about secondary storms. And I think there is something so profound for someone who is listening today that you have to hear this, that it is not often the storm that we are confronted with, but the way that we respond to the storm that actually ends up being the thing that gets in our way. And I know there to be truth in this for me, because I was confronted with insecurity or overwhelm or new circumstances or whatever. And it wasn't often that first thing. It was the way I'd reach for a drink, the way that I would try and bury myself in my work, the way that I would do a whole host of things to not have to deal with the feelings or the emotion that was coming up in that thing, instead of actually doing the work to understand why I was feeling what I was feeling and how to make sense of what to do next, now that next is different than it was. But I do think in all of it, right, there's shame in that secondary storm. There's shame in the way that we respond to things that don't necessarily serve us getting from where we are to where we want to go. And yet, if we're just willing to acknowledge that this is where we are, this is the stuff we have to process and deal with, we give ourselves a chance to eliminate that secondary storm from even being a thing we have to deal with in the first place.
Well, what's really interesting is you were just talking about how running has been your greatest coping mechanism in the last year or two. I think there's this moment you told in the book, which I'd love to hear you tell and correct, because I'm going to botch these details. But you were running, and didn't your neighbors drive up beside you, and they introduced themselves, and they ended up being close friends, and how you needed them in that moment. Talk about that. What happened?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I have a chapter in the book that's about faith. And I think part of the courage that's necessary in where we're headed is having faith that the resources, the relationships, the confirmation of the promise of our ability to get to the other side where the shore exists will present themselves even when we don't necessarily have evidence at the beginning of the journey. And for me, as much as at the beginning of my transition out of Disney into entrepreneurship or out of marriage into divorce, I had people that would tell me, don't worry, you've got this. I had a hard time believing it because I did not yet myself have evidence that it was all going to work out the way that it was going to. And it's only now in hindsight that I've gained some of the perspective of the way that believing that it was going to work itself out actually introduced the evidence, and that it was that belief that allowed me to see it in the midst of the journey. And so the story of my neighbors, in fact, was one where I was running head down in the mouth, not interested necessarily in engaging in any kind of conversation, but there was something in this conceit around the people that you need in your life will present yourself to help you along this journey if you can just raise your eyes enough to see them. And so that day, because of that thing that was running in my unconscious, I ran past them head down and then ended up turning around to actually take off my sunglasses and introduce myself. And as it turned out, these were people who had just moved in down the street. They'd actually relocated from California like I had a couple years earlier. They happened to have two kids that were the same ages as mine. And it became this friendship and therapy and people that would help make sure I was eating food on the days when I didn't feel like eating, that I needed more than anything at the very beginnings of a divorce that was just earth-shaking for me. And that kind of a circumstance was repeated over and over with the pastor of my church sending the same 11-word text every single day for the first 8 weeks of my divorce. What small piece of sadness can I hold for you today? A profound 11 words that trust me, if you go through something hard, you're going to want your pastor to send you every single day for 8 weeks. The stranger in Instagram who every day for some 6 months sent me an encouraging prayer in a direct message, not knowing me from anyone, that just felt called to remind me of my truth on the days that I might forget it. And so like these little like micro things that would show up along my journey, they again were just this reminder that if you believe that these things will show up on the journey and can stay observant of them while you're on it, that you'll see them.
You know, it makes me think while you're saying this, Dave, maybe you need to quiet yourself, still yourself to remember, as in member again, bring together again the truth of who you've been created to be by a creator who loves you infinitely. And Dave, this came into play in your life in such a powerful way. This is, again, part of the conversation where I love how vulnerability and community throw lifelines to other people, because though I'm not married and have not been married, there is this portion of your book that I read that brought me to tears. And it was in this, Dave, where you said, "Only now can I see how the decision to pursue this future together came at a time when my judgment was compromised. My vision was impaired." And that leveled me right there. My midlife moment had disabled my ability to tap into my own imagination. So I borrowed someone else's. I think this hits home for a lot of people, Dave. You know, something in life seems to disable our ability to see and live from our essence and our true identity, but it starts with how we're seeing, not just what we're seeing, but how we're seeing. Dave, talk about how your vision was impaired and even the circumstances surrounding inform that, because that's really key.
Yeah. So that comes out of a chapter called Sailing Off of Someone Else's Map, which I do believe to be a circumstance that many people might relate to. I found myself after a 17-year career at Disney, understanding that I was disconnected from the reason why I've been put on this planet, right? I had the trappings of things that made sense to and were from, in many, many ways, the dream job of many other people. And yet I did not feel like I was using the gifts that God had created for me, and didn't really totally understand it until maybe a year and a half before I made the decision to leave. I was out back with my kids in our hot tub where my middle son, I had 9, 7, and 4-year-old boys at that time, asked me a very simple question, which was, "Dad, what's your greatest fear?" Right? We played this game. You could ask any question. It was usually gross stuff that boys ask. And here he'd ask me a silly question looking for tarantulas or scorpions. And out of my mouth fell not living up to my potential, right? Like my biggest fear was not living up to my potential. And in saying it out loud, it was a thing that had been living inside of my intuition, my knowing, the like voice of God kind of whispering inside of me. And now that I'd said it out loud, it was real, because I realized I was in real time living into my greatest fear, that I was doing work that was as defined by society in the eyes of my parents, who I love and are great people, as respected by, people inside of the Hollywood filmmaking business. It was a great job. And yet, because of the unbelievable collection of intellectual property and the greatest filmmakers of all time, it just didn't take as much as it did at the beginning of my working there to convince movie theaters to take Avengers and Star Wars movies. And so I, at this critical in between my 30s and 40s threshold, as I'm asking these bigger existential questions of why I've been placed on this planet, am now face to face with my greatest fear and have to make a decision. Am I going to stay living in my biggest fear? Or am I going to depart from it and do something that might challenge my comfort, but ultimately allow me to leave my career for my calling? And in doing so, I found myself stepping into something that was new, leaving what I had previously known for what I needed. And I think that there is something for all of us in appreciating, hey, if we can connect to what we need, it will likely require the courage to leave what we've known, to challenge the things that have historically told us who to be and how to be seen as good, to play right, to be a good man or a good mom or whatever it ends up being. And my decision to try and pursue unlocking my calling, of course, ended up becoming something that was challenging and disarming and disorienting, but also was a provocateur of growth, and it was something that in that growth would allow me to step closer to the intention of that creator who put me here for the reasons that I know I'm here for.
I'd love to stay on courage and really the mechanics of it, Dave, because risk taking, risk assessment, and really even learning how to learn from loss, I think are facets of developing courage in life. How does this play out for us? How do we do it mechanically?
Well, I mean, the simplest and most important first thing is to find a way to inoculate yourself from the things you fear the most by taking small doses, right? Like in like the most simple form, when you think of inoculation, not to get into a vaccination kind of conversation, but you take a very, very small dose of the thing that you are trying to stay immune from. And that small dose creates in your body an ability to withstand the full dose. And so the same is true for our fear. Our fear is a disease. And so if you can find a way, you got a fear of public speaking, great. You need to take a small dose of your fear. And instead of speaking for 60 minutes, speak for 60 seconds until you can speak for 3 minutes, until you can speak for 30, until you can speak for 60. And does it mean that you're going to be great at it at first? No, you are not going to be great at anything that you fear or have no competency in at the beginning. But the worry of not being good, or the worry of like what it might mean to do this new thing, is something that only is overcome in reframing what we believe we can do because of having done something we've never done before. And so the story I tell in the book about climbing a mountain is an interesting one, because as much as it ends up being a physical challenge, I put myself in a position to do a thing called Everesting. 29029. It's the number of linear feet to the top of Mount Everest. And there's an event that I jumped into where for 35 and a half hours of a 36-hour challenge, I climbed a mountain 13 times to equal the distance to the top of Mount Everest. And it was a thing that I have no competency in mountain climbing. It was 13-hour and 45-minute hardest workouts of my entire life. And in doing it, I was able to reframe what I believe myself to be capable of physically in a way that I could not have appreciated until I actually tried it. And the interesting story in it is the week before I went to climb the mountain, was running my long runs on Sundays that were, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 miles at about an hour's worth of time, which is not a bad thing because that was the standard at which I held my long run. And then I went and did 13 consecutive hour and 45-minute things that had me reframe fundamentally what I am mentally, physically, and emotionally capable of. And as I came off the mountain the following Sunday, when I went to go do my long run, the idea of quote unquote only running 5 or 6 miles for only 60 minutes seemed ridiculous, since I now had a new data set that said, oh, no, Dave, you know you can do 35 consecutive hours of physical exertion. You just did. It was last week. And so I, in that moment, decided, you know what? I'll see if I can run a half marathon this weekend.
Wow, Dave.
A neighborhood half marathon. And I ran 13.1 miles in my neighborhood for about 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I felt something extraordinary in having now, with this new set of knowledge and reframing what I was capable of, jumping into a new reset of what I could do in a long run. I did it 19 consecutive weekends. The 20th weekend, I ran my first marathon. I've subsequently jumped into a triathlon. I'm training for an Ironman. I did it though, because I now know I can. And I think the same thing applies to fear, right? You are afraid because you don't think you can, or you in some ways have some story that has been told to you of what it will mean to try and not do it well. And it's only when you try it, when you inoculate yourself with a smaller dose of the thing you're afraid of, that you reframe the ridiculousness of having that fear in the first place.
I'm really curious on the other side of this then, how being risk averse affects our mental and emotional health. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, this will sound dramatic, and I don't mean to be, but I do really believe that you are either growing or dying, which is a kind of dramatic thing to say, but you're either growing or dying. I don't think that there is a neutral. I don't think you can tread water. You're one or the other. It's binary. And I have come to appreciate that fulfillment for us as humans exists in a state of growing, in a state of growth. So if you're interested in feeling unstuck or full or fulfilled or closer to purpose, it only can happen in a state of growth, which means if we are convincing ourselves to stay inside of comfort or are risk averse, as you say, then we are guaranteeing, we're gaming the system toward death. And that is something that, again, like you can justify in some respects, because so many of us are so used to the suffering we are familiar with that we have convinced ourselves that it's safer to stay in something we know than to push ourselves into something we don't, because of the fear of what that new might look like. Even if it meant escaping the thing that is creating suffering in real time, we're more comfortable, we're more content with the predictability of suffering. Sometimes that suffering is a part of our identity in a way that makes us say, you know what, this is just who I am. This is just who, it's not my lot in life. I'm okay to just be okay. And that comes in the trade-off of what growth could provide and how you might feel more fulfilled, but requires the courage to challenge the things that you've become comfortable with.
Okay, I'm calling on Audible. You all need to hit pause, hit rewind, and listen to the last 60 seconds of what Dave just said. Simple as that. Do it right now. Do it right now. I don't care if you're driving. Do it right now. But Dave, it's interesting because you wrote this in the book. We're all victims of a harbor in which we find ourselves anchored. That correlates, right?
It completely correlates. Number one, if you are not a fan of analogies to the sea, then I really feel badly about you having purchased this book, because I have a lot of them in this book. But as a person who does not himself do well at sea, it seemed like the easiest and best way to try and drive home the point. The harbor is just our comfort zone. I mean, like, it's called a safe harbor for a reason. I've described it as being surrounded on all sides by our fear. It is like a moat that surrounds the things that we are comfortable with. And the only way we can get to learning, the only way that we can unlock the growth that happens on the other side of learning is by pushing straight into and working through our fear. There's no drawbridge. You've got to go through it. And the idea of that harbor is something that we have become in some ways romantic with, right? We have romanticized the circumstances that we know and are familiar with, because we believe in the illusion of control. We believe that there is some predictability in the knowns. And I, as a person who have very recently experienced a safe harbor being washed away by a storm, part of what you have to appreciate is the illusion of the safe harbor. And that is, nothing is safe. Ask the people who founded Blockbuster. Ask the people who were working at Sears or Tower Records or Pan Am Airlines. Like, there is no safe harbor. And so the sooner we can reconcile that, the things that exist today may not in fact exist tomorrow, it might in part give us permission to challenge the way that we've developed a relationship with what we know in real time about the current circumstances we are inside of, and how unpredictable it actually is that they may exist in the future.
I think right there's a really strong call to action, because oftentimes I think we put too much stock in assuming things are going to be the same tomorrow. And you said the things that exist today aren't guaranteed to exist tomorrow. And so therefore, for everyone joined today, Dave has a whole section on identity in his book, Built Through Courage. And again, go to the show notes right now, get a copy. But Dave, one of the things that I extrapolated from reading the book is how you are teaching us how to live life and say yes to our true identity, to say yes to our purpose from a place of calling, not obligation. And I think those are really, really different mile markers in the journey when we're saying yes through fear and obligation to people pleasing and others versus I know that I know that I know. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah. What's interesting, I mean, and I ended up telling the story about it too, but I followed what to me was a pretty conventional map of where you're meant to go in career building.
Yeah.
And then in the, jumping from Disney into following the dream of someone else and my ex-wife, who I will be a champion of forever, but ultimately thought, as much as I might work with her for all time, realized that my decision to try and pursue a dream of hers, that it was not in fact my dream, when I really started listening to calling, that like beating heart, that intuition, the knowing voice of God, I happen to have a serendipitous, providential kind of God moment on an airplane with Dan Rather.
I want to hear about this. Yeah.
I mean, it's like, of all the things, and this just shows you what a nerd I was growing up, but my childhood heroes were Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings. Like, I wanted to be a reporter. I loved the way that they were able to take information, consolidate it, storytell, and help people understand in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to. And it was something that just ignited passion and spoke to some of the skills that I had as a person who could speak and my desire to have impact on others. And when I thought about who I wanted to be when I was 19 years old at Pepperdine University, as an anchor on the news channel, as a DJ at the vaunted 2 a.m. time slot, like, I wanted to be Dan Rather. And here I found myself in the midst of identity change, sitting next to him on an airplane where generously for 2 hours of his life, he ended up talking with me about his life and his work and his calling. I had this reminder of who I wanted to be before I became who I'd become. And I think for so many of us, coming back to who we wanted to be before we became who we thought we needed to become, or who society told us to become, who our parents expected us to become, who the 19-year-old versions of ourselves were on fire for before the 38-year-old versions of ourselves were bummed about who is required of us now. That gave permission for me to reconnect to that 19-year-old and really ask, okay, hey, as much as conventionally this work that I do now might be harder for me to explain to my grandma, who's turning 100 in December, God bless her, I am more sure of my purpose being connected to this desire to be a reporter from me at 19 than I've been about almost anything else. Like, my calling was in my being and connected to my essence then. And I started to deny it when I started listening to the trappings of, if you can make this living or have this title or work in this business, then you will, to the outside world, to society, be acceptable, you'll be lovable. And I pursued that. And I had a great career. And I don't for a second take anything away from the awesomeness of the opportunity that was afforded and a lot of the privilege that exists in my life because of it. But also, I denied a lot of who I was and who I'm here to be until I was, providentially sat next to him on a plane and found myself in the midst of my own identity crisis, given an opportunity to reclaim who I am now that I wasn't any longer who I'd been.
I'm getting so rocked right now because that part of your story is so similar to mine, and in having this bit of my essence be deeply, I was telling a friend this, Dave, I've always been just deeply curious, deeply sensitive, deeply gentle in my temperament. And when I was a little boy, I saved up at 11 years old and bought my first microphone for $11 at Radio Shack. Couldn't plug it in anywhere, so I just wrapped the cord up, put it in my pocket, and I would walk around just asking people questions. And this fascination with broadcast just enraptured me. And so hearing you share that about Dan Rather and even reading about that, man, it fires me up. And I hope for people listening today, it fires you up today too, because there is an essence, there is an identity, there is a purpose for which you were created. And, to use the analogy of the fact that we all wear capes, we all were born with a cape. And because life got hard and our parent died too young, or the divorce happened, or the bills just piled in, that cape had to be hung up. And I feel like someone needs to hear today, it's time to just revisit that cape. And I don't mean for that to sound stupid and woo-woo. What I mean is, you got to get back to your essence.
Yeah. This is, again, it goes back to that primary question. Do you believe that there was deliberate intention when you were created? If you believe that you were conceived with this very intentional and deliberate means with which you were put on this planet, that your experiences are unique to you, that your wiring is unique to you, that the skills that you have are unique to you, that your ability to impact is unique to you, then how do you feel about the obligation to honor that intention? because it is something that I believe exists in each of us, but also requires courage to step closer to honoring the intention, because often it requires a departure from something we've become comfortable with, or the way that others have been comfortable with the way that we've been showing up in their life. And so for so many of us, we listen to or worry about what it might mean to allow that whisper that's getting louder inside of us to actually speak out loud. Because, oh man, my partner has really become used to me being this way, or society expects me to operate in this way, or the other moms at PTA or the other dads who are real men, or the whatever it is, have come to expect that I will continue to show up in the way that I've shown up, even though it's been at the expense of you fully being truthful to who you are or denying part of yourself. And so the question is, can you honor your intention? Can you be true to who you are and step closer to it, not in an irresponsible way, right? Like, I don't want someone to hear this to be like, oh yeah, I've always been called to be a t-shirt salesman in Hawaii and not make any money or support my family. No, that's not what this is.
Exactly.
This is, there was something that you've known in the recesses of your mind for years and years and years, but have pushed away because it's silly, or it's going to make you uncomfortable, or it's going to require you to put yourself out there and potentially not be great at it at the beginning. That's the thing I'm talking about.
Which takes us back to where you started, and it's integrity. It's the integer. It's the wholeness.
Yeah. That's
powerful. Dave, how'd you know you're ready to date again?
I was not ready to date again. That is the answer. I was definitely not ready to date it again. I don't know how to explain it other than to say the circumstances under which I was introduced to this person who had the set of experiences that were so similar to my own, in that each of us found ourselves, right? Change either is something that you choose or chooses you, right? Like, we each were someone who change had chosen.
Yes.
We each had in our set of values the thing that was most important in our life, our kids and our family, the way that we had intermingled businesses with our exes, the things that she was able to share further along in the journey, took what was a chance encounter and turned it into a friendship, that in that friendship afforded me feeling seen and normal, that in that seen and normal over time, over months of time. I mean, we exchanged more songs and more texts, and then started watching, we started watching shows on Netflix and did virtual church on Sundays. And it just, like, over time, it just like gave way to, we should have dinner. And I mean, honestly, like, even at that, I invited her to dinner, not knowing if we were having a date or just hanging out as friends. And about 4 hours of sitting with a 4-foot pillow between the two of us, our hands finally grazed against each other. And I was like, oh my goodness, what is happening? And even then, I don't know that I knew that I was ready to date. I am. What's interesting in everything that has happened in the last couple of years, when you think you have a handle on the way things are going to happen, and then they don't happen that way, you end up getting permission to open yourself up to the possibility that anything is possible. I mean, you could see that as like anything is possible in a negative way. And I've just come to appreciate that anything is possible in a positive way. Like, I use the quote in the book, but there's a Tyler Durden quote in Fight Club. Once you lose everything, you're now free to do anything. And so my approach in this last stretch of time has to just been open to the possibility that all of this is happening for me, and that by saying yes to things I might not have previously said yes to, it might be part of how I become this person I'm meant to be. And if it's not, I'm going to learn, and it's still going to be part of how I become the person that I'm meant to be.
My goodness, Dave, this has been such a rich, value-adding conversation for me, and no doubt the listeners as well. Hey, before we land this plane today, is there anything else you'd like to share? Is there anything else that is pertinent for us to know? What else is on your heart, my friend?
Well, I mean, I'll end with the tattoo. I mean, like, it's the thing that I talk about all the time, because it has been my mantra for 5 years now of pushing myself into uncomfortable situations for the opportunity to grow. The tattoo is a John Shedd quote. It is, a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships were built for. And I got it in the midst of my transition from Disney, have had to recite it through entrepreneurship, have certainly in the identity shift of having husband be a primary identifier to not being married, just as a reminder that I am built for the choppy waters that live outside of my own safe harbor. And I just want to encourage anyone who's listening today who feels the tug to challenge yourself for those choppy waters. You're going to be unmoored. You're going to get out there and it's going to feel uncomfortable and choppy, and it's supposed to. I hope this doesn't sound vain. I am in the best shape of my life, in all ways, the best spiritual shape, mental, physical, emotional, relational shape of my life. And when I made that declaration at the end of 19 that I was going to have my best year ever, what I didn't appreciate was that I was not going to have a say in the conditions through which my best year would manifest. And 2020, as much as it was for so many of us, for so many reasons, the hardest year of my life, when I look back at the end of my life, where the legacy of my life will have been the byproduct of the next 40 years, not the first 40. When I'm asked what was the most important year of my life, I am positive that among the very most important years will be 2020, because the hardest year of my life actually also was the best year of my life, at least at this point in my life, not in spite of the things that I went through, but because of them. And the thing I would say to anyone who's going through a hard time, who's feeling struggle, number one, that struggle is a sign of your humanity. It is not an indictment of you not being good or worthy. But also, please recognize that the struggle you are in is something that you were built for, because it is through your willingness to stay in this fight on those uneven seas that you will inevitably become the captain of that ship. And so as I have to every once in a while, even in a hokey way, recite to myself that you, Dave, were built for this, I want to say to somebody who needs it today, you were built for this, that you will come out the other side the stronger version of yourself because of, not in spite of, these hard things that you're having to go through.
I got to land it there because I don't want to diminish the strength of what you just said. Dave, thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course. No. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it, brother.
Likewise, Dave. Hey, before I let you go, how can people stay connected to you? I want people to just not only get a hold of the book, but just connect to you, because I think you're doing a great work.
Thanks, man. Well, if you want to grab the book, I will just throw this out in real time. We've created a really rad community in this Built Through Courage launch team. If you hit mrdavehollis.com/book, with your pre-order, immediately you get jumped into this community of just people that are uplifting and encouraging people every single day. We're doing a weekly coaching for free with me, where we're going topic by topic through the book. You get an immediate access to a course about finding your why, and a resilience and mindset course, and just community with a bunch of like-minded people. So if you're interested, jump in there. But I do a lot of the stuff that I do online on Instagram. So Mr. Dave Hollis is my handle. You're welcome to jump in and follow the shenanigans that are my everyday there. But I appreciate you, Christopher. I appreciate you having me on. Thanks, been rad, Dave, to just hang out and chat.
Yeah, it has been awesome. And again, guys, go there now, mrdavehollis.com/book or wintoday.tv/episode 265. Dave, thank you for today.
Right on.
What an awesome conversation with Dave. And again, mrdavehollis.com/book or wintoday.tv/episode 265. Again, wintoday.tv/episode 265. Go there right now. And next week is my birthday, but next week on the podcast is my good friend, Dr. Kurt Thompson. He's been on the podcast before, where we talked all about the soul of shame. Well, this time we're talking about the soul of desire. What does that mean? Well, for starters, it's one of the most gut-wrenching, emotional conversations I've ever had here on the podcast, and you're going to want to tune in and take a lot of notes and pass it along and listen over and over again. Here's a preview.
I'm able to say the things that I need to say. And so,
that's so good.
one of the most important things about the healing of trauma is the presence of others to whom I can look. When we do what we call EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, one of the primary ways that intervention works depends upon how people, first of all, they develop what we call resources. We imagine, like, we're going to have you reimagine a traumatic event, but we're going to have you take your primary resourcers with you. Who are those people going to be? Well, I'm going to imagine Jesus being in the room. I'm going to imagine my good friend Chris being in the room. I'm going to imagine my best friend George being in the room. All these people are going to be in the room with me. And we're then going to replay this. And I'm going to notice them noticing me, and I am not by myself.
It's my birthday episode. Don't miss it. Next week, Dr. Kurt Thompson, right here on Win Today. Thanks again for joining the conversation this week, right here on Win Today. I believe people just like you should be able to live successful, meaningful lives, and that's why I want to invite you to join the inner circle of readers on my email list who get weekly, well-researched self-improvement tips. So right now, go to wintoday.tv to sign up. It's absolutely free. And lastly, whether you're a new listener or have been listening to the show for a while, I'd really appreciate your rating and review of Win Today on the Apple Podcast app. So right now, will you write a short, honest review? Doing so helps expand the listenership of Win Today, and that would mean a ton to me. Thanks again for listening today. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.